My fiancée slept with my boss while I funded our wedding and her career, so I quit, moved states, ghosted everyone, and thrived quietly alone. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and for most of my adult life, I believed real love meant sacrificing quietly and building something bigger than yourself, even when no one was watching. I grew up learning that being dependable was the same thing as being valuable, that saying yes proved maturity, and that carrying weight without complaint was just part of being a good man. So when I met my fiancée, during a messy, uncertain chapter of both our lives, it felt natural to step into that role without hesitation. We met when neither of us had much figured out. She talked about ambition like it was oxygen, about wanting more than survival, more than mediocrity, more than being overlooked. I recognized that hunger because I'd been carrying it quietly my whole life. Late nights turned into long conversations about futures that felt just out of reach, and somewhere between shared fears and shared plans, I convinced myself this was what partnership looked like. My career was demanding but stable, the kind of job that drained you but paid enough to justify the exhaustion. I didn't mind being the financial backbone of the relationship. Covering more than my share felt like investing, not losing. When she needed certifications, I paid. When she wanted to attend networking events, I rearranged my budget. When she talked about career pivots, I told her, "We'll figure it out," and meant it every time. I saved aggressively without telling her the numbers, quietly building what I thought would be our wedding fund. Not because she asked, but because I wanted to be ready. Ready to prove that stability, loyalty, and patience still meant something. Ready to show her that believing in someone looked like action, not just words. At the time, I didn't feel used. I felt proud. I felt chosen. I genuinely believed we were building a life rooted in trust, teamwork, and shared sacrifice. I didn't realize that while I was laying foundations, something underneath us was already starting to crack. At first, helping her felt temporary, like something we'd laugh about later when life finally stabilized. She was always just one step away from her breakthrough, one more certification, one more course, one more connection that would finally open the right door. Every time she said, "This is the last thing I'll need," I wanted to believe her, because believing felt easier than questioning. I covered exam fees without hesitation. I paid for professional clothes she said she needed to look the part. When she talked about conferences and networking events, I'd nod and say, "Go, this is important," even when it meant pushing my own expenses aside. She'd hug me tightly afterward and say things like, "I don't know what I'd do without you," and I wore those words like a badge of honor. There were moments, though, small ones, that didn't sit right. She started guarding her phone more carefully, angling the screen away when she texted. Her schedule became vague, filled with late meetings and last-minute changes that were hard to track. When I asked simple questions, she'd sigh and say, "You wouldn't understand how competitive this industry is," like curiosity was the same thing as control. I told myself I was being insecure. I reminded myself that successful people were busy, that ambition came with chaos. I didn't want to be the kind of man who held his partner back with doubt or jealousy. So I swallowed the discomfort and doubled down instead: more support, more trust, more patience. Meanwhile, my savings account kept growing thinner in ways I didn't like to calculate too closely. I stopped upgrading my own life, stopped taking breaks, stopped asking myself hard questions. Whenever fear crept in, I silenced it with logic: this is what building together looks like. But late at night, lying next to her while she slept facing away from me, I started feeling something unfamiliar. Not anger. Not jealousy. Just the quiet, unsettling sense that I was giving more than I was being allowed to see. I didn't notice it all at once. That's the part that still bothers me the most: how slowly my boss entered our lives, like background noise you don't register until it's too loud to ignore. At first, his name came up casually, sprinkled into conversations the way coworkers usually are. "He's actually really supportive," she said once, scrolling on her phone. "He sees potential in me." My boss was the kind of guy people admired without questioning. Confident, charming, well-connected, the kind of man who could change someone's career trajectory with a single recommendation. At work, he joked with everyone, remembered names, slapped shoulders, and made you feel seen just enough to keep you loyal. I'd watched him build that reputation for years, so when my fiancée talked about him like a mentor, I didn't think twice. She started mentioning him more often after that. Stories about long conversations after meetings. Advice he'd given her about navigating politics, about standing out, about thinking bigger. She'd smile when she talked about him, energized in a way I hadn't seen in a while, and I told myself it was just confidence growing. Then came the work events. Company mixers, dinners, informal gatherings she said were important for visibility. Sometimes I went with her, sometimes I couldn't because of my schedule. When I did show up, my boss would greet her warmly, laugh easily with her, then nod at me like I was an accessory rather than a person. Once, on the drive home, she said, "You should be grateful he's taking an interest in my career like this." I remember gripping the steering wheel and replying, "I am," even though something about the way she said it felt off. Like I was supposed to be thankful for his presence in our lives. Around the same time, my work hours stretched longer. Late nights. Unexpected deadlines. While I was staying at the office, she was out at dinners that ran late, coming home buzzing with stories she summarized quickly. I didn't see it then, but a new dynamic had formed. One where my absence created space. And where someone else was quietly stepping into it. The wedding planning started suddenly, like a switch had been flipped overnight. One day we were casually talking about venues, and the next she was sending me links, spreadsheets, and timelines with urgency in every message. "It's not that expensive if you think about it," she kept saying, even as the numbers stacked higher than anything I'd imagined. I told myself this was normal, that weddings were stressful, that pressure didn't mean anything deeper. She became fixated on details that felt less about us and more about how everything would look. The venue had to impress. The guest list had to include the right people. Certain upgrades were labeled non-negotiable because, as she put it, perception matters when you're building a future. Every time I hesitated, she'd remind me this was an investment, not just in us, but in her career, her image, our standing. I watched my savings dip lower than I was comfortable with, but I didn't say much. I'd worked too hard to become the guy who suddenly counted pennies. When doubt crept in, I pushed it down by reminding myself I'd planned for this, that love sometimes meant stretching farther than what felt safe. I didn't want her to think I was pulling back now that things were getting real. What unsettled me was how often my boss's name slipped into the conversation. He had opinions about venues. He knew what kind of wedding looked right for ambitious people. Once, she casually mentioned he'd said a certain setup would send the right message. I laughed it off, but something in my chest tightened anyway. Planning meetings replaced intimacy. Spreadsheets replaced conversations. When I tried to talk about how overwhelmed I felt, she brushed it aside and said, "This is just what commitment looks like." And I believed her, because I always had. But late at night, staring at numbers on my laptop while she slept peacefully beside me, I started wondering who this wedding was really for. And whether I was still part of the picture, or just financing it. The first real crack didn't come with a fight or a dramatic revelation. It came quietly, in the form of small things that didn't line up no matter how generously I tried to explain them. A meeting that ran too late. A dinner that changed locations halfway through the night. Stories that sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced them before saying them out loud. One night, she came home later than usual, heels in her hand, makeup slightly smudged, energy completely off. She wasn't angry or defensive, just distant, like she was still somewhere else mentally. When I asked how her evening went, she said, "Fine," and immediately changed the subject. I remember standing there, keys still in my hand, feeling invisible in my own apartment. I started noticing her phone more after that. The way she angled the screen away from me. How quickly she locked it when I walked into the room. If I asked who she was texting, she'd laugh and say, "Relax, it's just work," like the idea of asking was somehow ridiculous. I hated the feeling it stirred in me, suspicion mixed with shame for even feeling suspicious. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself scrolling through social media. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just trying to quiet the noise in my head. That's when I noticed my boss's name again. Likes that felt too frequent. Comments that felt too familiar. Inside jokes I wasn't part of. When I finally brought it up, I chose my words carefully. I told her I felt disconnected, that something felt off lately. She sighed deeply and said, "You're overthinking this. You've been stressed and it's making you paranoid." The word paranoid stuck with me long after the conversation ended. That night, lying next to her while she slept peacefully, I realized something had shifted. Trust didn't shatter, it thinned. And once it thins, everything starts to feel fragile. The truth didn't come from a confession or a dramatic slip-up. It came from a mistake, one small, careless error that unraveled everything I'd been forcing myself not to see. I was at work, half-focused, running on caffeine and anxiety, when an email notification popped up on my phone that wasn't meant for me. It was forwarded accidentally, buried in a chain of messages with my fiancé's name and my boss's corporate email side by side. At first, I didn't understand what I was reading. Then my brain caught up, and my chest went tight in a way I'd never felt before. There were no vague phrases, no room for interpretation. Just words that shouldn't exist between two people unless something had already crossed a line. I read messages about nights I thought she'd been networking. Jokes about how convenient my long hours were. Comments about how supportive I was, framed like a weakness, like something to work around. One message casually referenced a hotel near a conference venue I had paid for her to attend. That's when my hands started shaking. I locked myself in a bathroom stall and reread everything again, hoping I'd misunderstood. But the timestamps lined up too cleanly. The language was too familiar. This wasn't a moment of temptation or a mistake fueled by emotion. It was ongoing. Planned. Carefully hidden behind the life I was funding. What destroyed me wasn't just the cheating. It was the realization that my sacrifices hadn't just been ignored, they'd been used. The certifications I paid for. The events I encouraged her to attend. The overtime I worked to give us security. All of it had created the perfect cover. I sat there on the cold tile floor, my phone glowing in my hands, feeling like my entire life had been rewritten without my consent. The future I thought I was building suddenly felt like a stage I'd been financing for someone else's performance. I didn't confront her that day. I went home, smiled when she talked, and listened like nothing had changed. But inside, something had snapped, and I knew whatever came next would destroy the version of us I still believed in. I didn't confront her right away because I needed to see how far the lie went when I stopped protecting it. For days, I watched her talk about work like nothing had changed, listened to her complain about stress while knowing exactly who was causing it. Every word felt rehearsed now, every smile calculated. The worst part was how normal she seemed, like betrayal was just another item on her schedule. When I finally confronted her, I didn't yell. I didn't throw my phone at her or demand explanations. I sat across from her at our kitchen table, slid the printed emails forward, and said quietly, "I know." The room felt too still, like even the air was waiting to see what she'd do. She didn't deny it. That shocked me more than anything. She stared at the papers for a moment, then leaned back and sighed like I'd just inconvenienced her. "It's not what you think," she said, which immediately told me it was exactly what I thought. She called it complicated. She said it started emotionally. She said my long hours made her feel lonely, unsupported, unseen. When I reminded her that those long hours paid for her certifications, her events, her lifestyle, she bristled. "You're always keeping score," she snapped. Then she said something I still hear in my head late at night, "Just because you provide doesn't mean you're present." In that moment, I realized she had rewritten our entire relationship in her mind, and I was the villain in it. I asked her how long it had been going on. She avoided the question. I asked if she loved him. She said, "That's not fair," like fairness still mattered. There was no apology, just justification layered on top of blame. The next day at work, things shifted. My boss stopped making eye contact. Meetings I used to lead were reassigned without explanation. Suddenly, my performance was being questioned in ways it never had been before. By the end of the week, I understood something terrifying. I hadn't just lost my relationship. I'd lost my safety, at home and at work. And I could feel the ground starting to give way beneath both. Everything unraveled faster than I thought it would, like once the truth surfaced, nothing was interested in staying intact anymore. At work, the atmosphere turned cold in ways that were impossible to document but impossible to miss. Emails went unanswered. Meetings happened without me. Feedback that used to be praise suddenly came wrapped in phrases like, concerns about attitude, and, lack of alignment. At home, things were worse. My fiancée moved through the apartment like a stranger who knew exactly where everything was. We spoke only in logistics, rent, dates, who would be home when. There was no apology, no attempt to fix anything. Just distance, and a quiet confidence that somehow she'd land on her feet no matter how this ended. Then the rumors started. Friends stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. People I'd known for years suddenly felt uncomfortable around me, like betrayal was contagious and they didn't want to catch it. I later found out she'd been telling a carefully edited version of the story, one where I was emotionally absent, controlling, and difficult to live with. And people believed it, because it was easier than asking questions. Financially, I was cornered. The wedding deposits were gone. My savings were depleted. I was still paying bills tied to a life that no longer existed. Some nights I sat on the edge of the bed staring at my bank app, feeling sick at how quickly years of discipline had evaporated. The lowest moment came one night when I sat alone in my car after work, hands on the steering wheel, unable to turn the key. I felt hollow. Not angry, just empty. Like everything I'd built my identity around had been stripped away at once. Provider. Partner. Professional. All gone. I realized then that I couldn't fix this. I couldn't explain my way out. I couldn't win by staying. And as terrifying as that realization was, another thought crept in right after it, quiet, unfamiliar, and dangerous. What if disappearing was the only way to survive what was left? The decision didn't come with anger or some dramatic breaking point. It came one morning when I woke up and realized I was tired of reacting. Tired of defending myself to people who had already decided who I was. Tired of explaining pain to people who benefited from misunderstanding it. For the first time since everything collapsed, my mind felt clear. I stopped arguing with her. Stopped trying to correct rumors. Stopped hoping someone would suddenly see the truth and take my side. Instead, I started doing things quietly. I updated my resume late at night. I applied for jobs in cities she'd never mentioned wanting to live in. I closed accounts we shared and rerouted my paycheck without making a speech about it. At work, I submitted my resignation without warning. No confrontation. No explanation. Just a short, professional email and my notice. My boss didn't try to stop me. He barely responded at all, which somehow confirmed everything I needed to know. I sold what I could, furniture, electronics, pieces of a life I'd outgrown overnight. I packed my car in stages so no one noticed all at once. I didn't tell friends, because I didn't trust who was still listening for the right reasons. The only person who knew I was leaving was my landlord. The night before I moved, I walked through the apartment slowly. Every room held a memory that felt heavier than the furniture itself. I stood in the doorway one last time, expecting to feel regret or fear. What I felt instead was relief. Not happiness. Not closure. Just relief. I didn't leave a note. I didn't block anyone. I didn't announce my departure on social media. I simply left. And as I crossed state lines with everything I owned in the back of my car, one question echoed louder than anything else. Who would I become when no one could reach me anymore? Starting over didn't feel empowering at first. It felt small, quiet, and lonely in ways no one warns you about. I moved into a modest apartment in a city where no one knew my name, my past, or the version of me that had been rewritten by other people. There were no dramatic fresh starts, no movie-style moments, just silence and unfamiliar streets. I took a job that wasn't glamorous but paid enough to breathe again. No office politics, no power games, no reminders of who I used to be. For the first time in years, my work ended when I left the building. I'd come home to empty rooms, eat simple meals, and sit with my thoughts longer than I was comfortable with. Some nights, the quiet felt peaceful. Other nights, it felt like punishment. I had to relearn who I was without anyone needing something from me. No one asking for money. No one measuring my worth by what I could provide. That adjustment was harder than I expected, because for so long, being useful had been my identity. Without that role, I felt exposed. I rebuilt slowly. I tracked my finances carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. I started sleeping better. I stopped checking my phone compulsively. The constant knot in my chest loosened just enough for me to notice it had been there all along. Sometimes, memories hit me out of nowhere, in the grocery store, at a stoplight, while folding laundry. I'd replay conversations, wondering if I should have fought harder or spoken louder. But every time that thought surfaced, another followed it just as clearly. If I had stayed, I would have disappeared anyway, just more slowly. I wasn't thriving yet. I wasn't healed. But I was no longer shrinking to survive someone else's narrative. Then, one evening, as I checked my phone after work, I saw a name I hadn't seen in months light up my screen. And I realized the past wasn't done knocking, it was just running out of ways to get my attention. The messages didn't come all at once. They trickled in slowly, like the past testing whether I was still reachable. At first, it was mutual friends, short, awkward check-ins disguised as concern. "Hey man, just wanted to see how you're doing." No apologies. No accountability. Just curiosity wrapped in politeness. Then her name appeared on my screen. I stared at it longer than I expected, my thumb hovering without moving. Her message was careful, almost formal, like she was writing to a stranger instead of someone she'd planned a life with. She said things had been hard. She said she'd had time to reflect. She said she hoped I was doing okay. Not "I'm sorry." Not "I hurt you." Just words designed to reopen a door without admitting why it had been closed. A week later, another message came, this time from a number I hadn't saved, but recognized immediately. My former boss. He wrote like someone used to control, not consequences. He said he'd heard I moved. He said there had been misunderstandings. He suggested we could clear the air if I ever wanted to talk. I felt my stomach tighten, then relax, when I realized I didn't owe him silence or confrontation. Through others, I learned what they didn't say directly. His reputation had started to crack. Not publicly, not explosively, but quietly. Patterns surfacing. Careers stalled. Whispers replacing admiration. The kind of fallout that doesn't trend, but never fully goes away. I also heard she struggled once my support vanished. Opportunities dried up. Bills became stressful. The confidence she'd worn so easily started to look forced. People moved on faster than she expected them to. I read every message once. Sometimes twice. Then I put my phone down. Not out of anger. Not out of spite. But because responding would have meant reopening a chapter one had already survived closing. Still, as calm as I felt, I knew something important was happening beneath the surface. The silence was doing something none of my words ever could. And for the first time, I understood that the ending was already writing itself, whether I participated or not. I don't know exactly when things shifted from surviving to thriving, because it didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where I woke up healed or suddenly felt victorious. It happened in pieces, small, almost forgettable moments that stacked up quietly. The first time I realized I hadn't thought about them all day. The first time my paycheck felt like mine again. The first time my peace didn't feel fragile. My life now looks nothing like the one I was building back then. There's no grand wedding plan, no curated image, no audience watching to see if I measure up. I live simply. I work hard, but I stop when the day ends. I come home to a space that's mine in a way the old one never really was. There's comfort in knowing no one is benefiting from my exhaustion anymore. I learned something I wish I'd understood sooner: love that requires you to erase yourself isn't love, it's convenience. Being needed isn't the same as being valued. And silence, when chosen intentionally, can be more powerful than any confrontation. I didn't win by exposing them or demanding justice. I won by removing myself from the story they needed me to play. Every now and then, I still get messages. They're rarer now, more desperate, less confident. I don't open all of them. Some I delete without reading. Not because they don't matter, but because I matter more than reopening wounds that finally closed. I don't hate my ex. I don't obsess over my former boss. I don't replay conversations wondering what I should have said. That chapter doesn't control me anymore, and that's the freedom I didn't know I was working toward all along. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. You don't always need revenge. You don't always need closure. Sometimes, the most satisfying ending is living well, quietly, independently, and far away from the people who only knew how to use you.